The god Loki birthed an 8-legged foal, blood pooling beneath him as he transformed from stallion back to divine form. The Norse celebrated this miraculous birth of Sleipnir, the greatest of horses. No one questioned why their gods could cross the boundaries that would destroy mortal men. The contradiction lived in every saga. Divine beings shifted between male and female as easily as changing clothes. Humans who attempted the same were crushed by social machinery, designed to prevent such crossing. In smoky longhouses, storytellers recited tales of Odin wearing women's robes to practice feminine magic. Listeners nodded in reverence. Those same listeners would exile or kill any man found adopting similar behaviours, sacred for gods, deadly for humans. Viking society created no word for male same-sex relationships. This absence was strategic, not ignorant. Language served power, not understanding. Behaviours that threatened social order were controlled through silence rather than prohibition. What could not be named could not be legally defended. The legal framework revealed its purpose through what it omitted. No law explicitly banned men from sexual contact with each other. Instead, codes punished those who occupied the passive role in such encounters. The act was not criminal. The position within it determined everything. Active participation preserved masculine status. Passive participation destroyed it completely. This division transformed every intimate encounter between men into a power transaction. One partner retained his social identity as a man. The other crossed into a different category entirely. Viking language had specific terms for this crossing: argr, ergi, sorðinn. Each word meant roughly the same thing: a male who had been sexually used, and was therefore no longer considered fully masculine. The machinery operated through selective application of rules. What enhanced divine power degraded human status. The identical behaviour carried opposite meanings depending on who performed it. The same community that celebrated Loki's shape-shifting would prosecute a man for similar gender flexibility. This was not hypocrisy but design. Authority determined interpretation. Position shaped consequences. The 8-legged horse galloped across the Norse sky, carrying messages between worlds. Below, mortal men walked carefully measured paths, ensuring their steps never suggested they had ever knelt in the wrong context. If you find these historical patterns compelling, consider subscribing to explore how ancient systems of control continue to influence modern masculinity. The runestone rose from the village centre like a granite finger pointing accusations skyward. Fresh chisel marks spelled out a single word: argr, the term branded deeper than hot iron. In Viking society, to call a man sexually passive triggered legal machinery that demanded blood in response. Honour functioned as social architecture. Each man maintained a fortress of reputation that required constant defence. A successful raid enhanced this structure. A good harvest strengthened it. But sexual submission demolished it completely, leaving nothing to rebuild upon. Icelandic law codes made this explicit. The Greigas legal texts granted any man accused of being sorðinn, meaning sexually used, the right to challenge his accuser to combat. This was not optional dispute resolution. This was mandatory violence. The legal system offered only two outcomes: kill the one who spoke the insult, or be killed defending against it. The accused could not simply deny the charge or demand proof. Words alone were considered sufficient evidence. The insult itself constituted the injury requiring remedy through bloodshed. This legal framework protected social hierarchy through deliberate imbalance. A Viking warrior who sexually dominated captives during raids was celebrated, not prosecuted. His actions demonstrated conquest and confirmed his status. The conquered man absorbed the defeat through his body, transforming from enemy to example. The vocabulary of masculine degradation expanded around this central obsession. Nid indicated general shame or disgrace. Rega suggested effeminacy or cowardice. Bloder meant soft or weak. Each term approached the same core anxiety. That masculine identity could be lost through the wrong kind of physical encounter. The system's power lay not in the words themselves, but in the categories they created. One's men feared so deeply they policed themselves to avoid them. Men learned to demonstrate hardness constantly. They avoided gentle gestures, prolonged eye contact with other men, or any behaviour that might suggest receptivity rather than dominance. The culture that valued masculine courage simultaneously prevented the emotional connections that might have supported it. Winter evenings in the Great Hall required careful choreography. Men sat with measured space between them on wooden benches. They shared ale but avoided gestures that might appear tender. Laughter was encouraged when it demonstrated dominance over others, discouraged when it suggested affection for them. The legal codes preserved the framework, but daily life enforced the reality. Men who had been accused, even falsely, found their voices carrying less weight in community decisions. Their presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. They moved through social spaces like ghosts of their former selves. The runestone stood as permanent reminder of how quickly social death could arrive. The carved name belonged to a man who still walked the settlement's paths, still performed necessary labour, still breathed and ate and slept. But socially, he had been erased. The stone marked his absence while his body continued its routines. Morning frost covered the carved letters, making them harder to read but impossible to ignore. The stone would outlast the man it condemned. The system would outlast both. The architecture of honour required constant maintenance through exclusion, accusation, and the ever-present threat of social annihilation. The man accused of being sorðinn sat cross-legged in the dirt outside the assembly hall, spine straight despite exhaustion. His hands rested carefully on his knees, positioned to show neither defiance nor submission. Every gesture had become calculated for survival. 3 days had passed since the accusation was made. No witness had seen any sexual act. No physical evidence existed. The legal process required neither. In Viking society, reputation could be destroyed through words alone, and words were considered as real as sword wounds. The morning sun cast long shadows across the settlement, while the accused maintained his vigil. Community members passed without acknowledgement, practicing the social blindness that protected them from association with his disgrace. Children were pulled away when they wandered too close, absorbing lessons about boundaries they were too young to understand. His accuser had thrown the term sorðinn like a spear, claiming the man had been sexually used during a recent raid. The word struck deeper than any physical weapon because it redefined identity rather than merely injuring flesh. Once spoken and believed by enough people, it became truth regardless of accuracy. The Gregos law codes treated verbal assault on masculine honour as more serious than physical violence. A broken arm could be set and healed. A shattered reputation could never be fully repaired. The legal system acknowledged this reality by making such accusations grounds for legitimate revenge killing. But revenge required social standing that had already been compromised by the accusation itself. The accused found himself in a trap designed by the system's internal logic. To fight back effectively, he needed the masculine credibility that the insult had already undermined. Nearby, the village continued its daily routines. Women drew water from the well, their conversations stopping when they noticed his presence. Merchants discussed trade agreements with elaborate casualness, demonstrating their ability to ignore his social death. The normal flow of community life parted around him like water around a stone. His wife had not spoken to him since the accusation was made. Not from personal conviction, but from social necessity. Association with his disgrace could contaminate her own reputation and that of their children. The system protected itself by making support for the accused socially dangerous. His position had become liminal, neither fully expelled from the community nor accepted within it. He existed in a space between social life and social death, useful as an example but denied the dignity of either category. Legal theory suggested he could challenge his accuser to combat, but practical reality made this option nearly impossible. Few would witness a duel involving a man whose masculine honour was already compromised. Victory would prove nothing. Defeat would confirm everything. No divine intervention would restore his position. The gods who transformed genders in myths offered no protection for humans who crossed social boundaries in reality. Sacred stories and secular laws operated in different realms with different rules. The legal process was complete. The social process would continue indefinitely. His body remained present. The law no longer recognized him as the man he once was. The raiding ship's deck ran slick with seawater and blood as Vikings completed their conquest of a coastal village. But the real victory was not the silver arm rings or ceremonial weapons stacked in wooden crates. It was the systematic breaking of the captured chieftain through ritualized sexual violence. The captured chieftain, once the voice of law and protection in his village, knelt in the ship's center, surrounded by laughing raiders, His decorated cloak had been torn away, leaving him naked in the salt spray. The Vikings had not removed his clothing for practical reasons. They had stripped him to prepare him for social demolition. This was not random cruelty. This was strategic degradation. Viking raids served multiple functions beyond material wealth acquisition. They were laboratories for testing techniques that could dissolve masculine identity through sexual conquest. The violence was procedural, designed to send specific messages to both victims and witnesses. The captured chieftain had been a leader in his community, respected for authority and lineage. His high status made the inversion more valuable to his captors. To break a leader was to break the concept of leadership itself. His humiliation would echo through every village that heard the story. The ship's wooden planks creaked under the weight of assembled raiders who formed a deliberate audience. This was educational theatre. Each observer learned what conquest meant when applied to human dignity rather than merely territory. The lesson was not about sexual satisfaction, but about the mechanics of social destruction. Rope burns marked the chieftain's wrists where he had been bound, not to prevent escape but to enforce the proper posture for his degradation. The Vikings had learned that forced positioning was more psychologically effective than simple violence. The body's arrangement conveyed messages that transcended individual suffering. The raiding captains supervised the proceedings with the same attention he gave to dividing treasure. Sexual conquest was as much a part of successful raiding as seizing material goods. Both forms of taking demonstrated the completeness of Viking dominance over their enemies. Cold wind whipped across the open water while the demonstration continued. The chieftain's breathing came in shallow gasps, each breath visible in the frigid air. His captors interpreted these physical responses as evidence of their success in reducing him from political leader to broken object. The other captured villagers were forced to watch, learning through observation what awaited anyone who continued to resist. The educational value of the spectacle multiplied as each witness absorbed the lesson about the consequences of opposing Viking authority. The ship's sail snapped in the changing wind as the raiders completed their ritual humiliation of the captured leader. His degradation had been thorough and public, designed to maximize both immediate psychological damage and long-term social consequences. The Vikings discussed their success in matter-of-fact terms, evaluating the effectiveness of different techniques, like craftsmen comparing tools. Sexual violence was technology to them, a method for achieving specific strategic objectives in their campaign of territorial expansion. The chieftain's eyes had gone blank, staring at the ship's deck without seeing. This emptiness was precisely what his captors had sought to achieve. They had successfully removed his sense of self, leaving behind a shell that would carry their message back to his people. The raiding ship turned toward home waters, carrying both material treasure and human trophies. The broken villagers would be returned to their homeland as living advertisements for Viking power. Their presence would speak louder than any threatening message about the consequences of future resistance. The system's efficiency lay in its self-replicating nature. Each act of sexual conquest produced not only immediate satisfaction for the raiders, but long-term psychological control over enemy populations. The broken men became walking warnings that discouraged others from opposing Viking expansion. No divine authority could restore what had been taken from the chieftain. Pagan or ancestral traditions offered no pathway back from the social death he had experienced. His degradation was permanent, designed to last beyond the immediate encounter. The broken chieftain would reach shore and return to his village. He would attempt to resume his former roles and responsibilities, but his community would read the defeat in his posture, his voice, his inability to meet direct eye contact. The Vikings had succeeded in creating permanent advertisements for their own power. The ship disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind changed men who would carry the raiders' message for the rest of their lives. What had begun as a raid had become doctrine. The system continued functioning. While mortals were destroyed for losing their masculine form, the gods had always crossed those lines without consequence. Long before raiders used the body to conquer, the gods had already written the rules about who could cross the line and who could not. Incense smoke curled around Odin's robed figure as he knelt in the posture reserved for seeresses. His fingers traced symbols in the dirt while his voice carried the rhythms of cedar magic. The All-Father wore women's clothing and practiced feminine arts. No one challenged his right to cross these boundaries. because gods operated outside the rules they imposed on mortals. The same acts that would mark a human man as ergi were celebrated when performed by divine authority. Odin's adoption of feminine dress and magical practices elevated him rather than degrading him. The crossing of gender lines was not permission for human imitation. It was demonstration of divine privilege. Candlelight flickered across the god's features as he wove spells that required receptivity, intuition, and surrender to forces beyond masculine control. These were precisely the qualities that would destroy a mortal man's social position. But power transforms rather than negates. What diminished humans enhanced gods. The double standard operated as a control mechanism rather than contradiction. By showing what was possible for divine authority, while forbidding it to human subjects, the system created a barrier more effective than simple prohibition. Mortals could see the potential for gender fluidity, while understanding that attempting it would result in social death. A farmer discovered practicing Seder became a target for accusation and exile. A king who consulted female seers became wise. The difference was not in the act, but in the actor's position within the hierarchy of power. Authority flowed downward, never sideways, never upward. The scent of burning herbs filled the sacred space where Odin continued his feminine-coded rituals. His transformation was temporary and voluntary. He could return to masculine presentation without consequence, because his essential authority remained intact. Mortals who attempted similar crossing found their social position permanently altered. This exemption served the system's stability. It channeled the human desire for gender fluidity into worship rather than practice. Men could admire divine transformation while learning to fear human imitation. The gods provided an outlet for forbidden desires that reinforced rather than challenged the social order. Odin's kneeling posture would have marked any mortal man as submissive, passive, ergi. But divine kneeling demonstrated mastery over forces that required receptivity to access. The same physical position carried opposite social meanings depending on who occupied it. The boundary between sacred and forbidden was not moral, but positional. Authority determined meaning. Context shaped consequence. The identical gesture could elevate or destroy based solely on the social rank of the performer. The system offered no pathway from human constraint to divine freedom. The gods were not role models, but barriers. They showed what was possible while making it impossible. They provided dreams that reinforced waking limitations. Divine exception proved human subjugation. The gods' freedom confirmed mortals' bondage. What elevated the powerful destroyed the powerless. The incense faded, but the boundary endured. Those with ultimate power could cross it freely, while those without were destroyed for even approaching it. The Viking obsession with masculine honor did not disappear even as their gods fell to outside forces. As Christianity spread through the royal conversion campaigns of Scandinavian monarchs, the Norse kingdoms were absorbed into a new moral architecture. The old vocabulary of shame was replaced, but not erased. The church retained the same fears, the same hierarchies, the same punishments. Christianity did not replace the Viking system of male control. It perfected it. The cross that arrived in Scandinavia carried familiar obsessions wrapped in new language. Where Norse law had protected masculine honor through blood feuds, Christian doctrine protected it through confession and penance. The words changed. The underlying architecture remained intact. Sunlight filtered through leaded glass windows onto the stone floor, where the accused knelt in required posture. His body still bore examination, still faced judgment. But now the violation was not merely of social honor, but of cosmic order. The stakes had expanded from exile to eternal punishment. The terms evolved with surgical precision. Argr became sodomite, ergi became abomination, nid became unnatural. Each new word carried reduced options for response. Under Viking law, an accused man could challenge his accuser to single combat. Under Christian authority, he could only confess and accept purification through pain. The whip continued its measured work while monks observed in mandated silence. This was not torture, but correction. The flesh was being taught lessons that the spirit had failed to learn. The scars would serve as permanent reminders of the body's capacity for sin and the soul's need for discipline. Christianity's innovation was the democratization of condemnation. Viking law had focused primarily on the passive partner in sexual encounters. Christian doctrine condemned both participants equally. no longer a hierarchy of shame, now universal guilt, now comprehensive surveillance of masculine behaviour. The monastery bells rang the hours while correction continued. Each strike of metal on flesh marked time that had been sanctified through suffering. The victim's pain was no longer personal humiliation, but cosmic justice. His body had become a battlefield where divine order reasserted itself against human corruption. The same logic persisted beneath new vocabulary. To receive, to yield, to soften remained violations of masculine essence. But now these violations carried implications beyond social death. They suggested spiritual corruption that could contaminate entire communities unless properly contained and corrected. Hot wax dripped from altar candles onto the stone floor, creating small pools that hardened quickly in the cold air. The victim's blood followed similar patterns, cooling and congealing as the lesson continued. The physical evidence would be cleaned away. The spiritual instruction was intended to be permanent. The system had gained efficiency through religious authority. No longer dependent on personal accusations that could be challenged through combat, it now operated through institutional confession that could be compelled through social pressure. The Church could demand admission of sins that Viking law had left unspoken. Incense smoke mixed with the metallic scent of blood as the correction reached its prescribed conclusion. The victim was released to tend his wounds and contemplate the relationship between physical pain and spiritual purification. He had been marked not only as shameful, but as evil. The transformation was linguistic as much as legal. Sin carried different implications than dishonour. Shame had been relational, dependent on community opinion. Guilt was existential, dependent on divine judgment. The system had expanded its reach from earth to eternity. The monastery returned to routine silence as afternoon prayers began. The correction was complete. The lesson would endure in scarred flesh and traumatized memory. The same behaviours, the same fear, the same control, different scripture, same submission. The bells continued ringing, the system continued functioning, the bodies continued bearing the cost of masculine architecture that had learned to speak in religious language while maintaining its essential purpose. Authority had found a new vocabulary, the machinery of control had found a new power source, the results remained consistent. Centuries passed. The gods who once punished deviation became forgotten myths. The crosses that once sanctified pain became cultural ornaments. But the architecture remained, not in temples or churches, but in schools, laws, diagnoses, jokes. In every place where men were expected to always be strong, dominant, and never vulnerable, the same system of control survived. No longer enforced with whips or exile, but with silence, ridicule, and quiet rejection. The system no longer needed priests or warriors. It needed only habit. In Viking halls, they avoided direct contact. In Christian monasteries, they did the same posture, the same fear, different justifications. Every system renamed the target. None released it. Stone tablets gave way to parchment scrolls, which gave way to printed laws, which gave way to medical texts, which gave way to digital platforms. The medium evolved. The message remained stable. The male body that yielded, that received, that failed to dominate continued moving through history like a shadow that no light could dissolve. Viking terms like argr and ergi faded into academic footnotes. Christian concepts like sodomy and abomination dominated legal discourse for centuries. Modern psychology introduced pathology and disorder. Each era found new language to mark the same deviation from masculine architecture. The consistency was structural, not accidental. Societies required mechanisms for defining and policing gender boundaries. The passive male body served this function across cultural transitions. It provided a stable target for systems that needed to demonstrate the consequences of stepping outside assigned roles. Contemporary slurs carried echoes of medieval insults, which carried traces of ancient accusations. The genealogy of shame extended across millennia without interruption. Languages changed. The wound remained open. In each iteration, the body was denied the right to speak for itself. It was interpreted, diagnosed, legally defined, religiously condemned, socially ostracized, but never allowed to determine its own meaning. Authority always belonged to systems rather than subjects. The thread connecting these historical moments was not belief, but repetition. Most people in any era could not explain why certain behaviors triggered such systematic responses. They simply learned to recognize the signs and participate in the consequences. Understanding was not required. Compliance was sufficient. Modern legal protections existed alongside ancient fears. Progressive language coexisted with primitive reactions. The system had learned to adapt its vocabulary while preserving its essential function. Tolerance was performed publicly, while enforcement continued privately. The mechanisms operated below conscious awareness. A gesture too feminine, a posture suggesting receptivity, a failure to demonstrate appropriate masculine hardness. These triggers activated responses that most people could not articulate but still felt compelled to perform. This was not history. This was machinery, ancient, durable, evolving. It did not require belief to function. It required only silence from those who recognized its operation, and compliance from those who did not. The gods who shifted genders remained safely confined to mythology. The men who attempted similar transformations remained vulnerable to contemporary versions of ancient punishments. The distance between divine freedom and human constraint had not diminished. 21st century bodies carried 21st century scars created by mechanisms that predated Christianity, predated written law, predated the civilizations that claimed to have evolved beyond such primitiveness. The thread had never broken. It had been woven deeper. In corporate boardrooms and playground confrontations, in family dinners and dating applications, in legislation and entertainment, the same architecture operated with the same function, different vocabulary, same violence. The machinery continued running. The targets continued suffering. The observers continued not seeing what they had been trained not to recognize. History was not past. It was present. It was operating.